Hello and welcome to What's Your Wrangle? I'm your host, Jennifer Shannon, and this season on What's Your Wrangle, we're deep diving into the innovation framework and the tools that can make that happen at your organization. Today, we're going to be talking about something really, really important, and that is the role of user experience and user experience design, and also the role of accessibility in your projects. So couldn't think of two better people to join me today than Katrina Rempel, who's the Senior Experience Designer, and Russell Hoy, who's a developer here at Rangle. Welcome.
Welcome.
So glad to have you guys here. I think probably the best place to start is for you guys to tell our listeners, our watchers, a little bit about yourselves, about your background, and also what your mandate here is at Rangle. Katrina, why don't we start with you?
Sure, yeah. So my role here at Rangle, as you mentioned, is I'm a senior experience designer. And just a little bit about my mandate. So I've been working on building out a little bit of a practice around user research and just kind of figuring out what that means and how we practice that on the projects that we have here.
Nice. Amazing. So how about you?
Yeah, so I'm a developer here at Rangle. So most of my time is spent, with my team building software, but I'm also on the UI architecture team here, which means I'm kind of responsible for, disseminating the leading practices for front-end development, in particular, making sure that the things we build are, delightful, accessible, maintainable, and performant. So my kind of role in particular has been focused on accessibility and how do we actually incorporate accessibility throughout our projects.
I would like a job that has delightful in the description. That sounds really nice. The part of your job is to make things delightful. That's pretty awesome. That's pretty amazing. So, Katrina, I, like everyone else, hear a lot of phrases that get thrown out there. So there's UX, UI, design thinking, customer journey mapping. They get interchanged and intermined all the time. So we're going to set the record straight today. So I'm wondering if you could give us what your take is on UX research, or what we should be calling that, what it actually means, and the role it plays in your work with the clients.
Sure, great. Yeah, so, we have things like customer experience, service design, all these other terms, but really, I think what's core to all those things is the user. The user is really, the person that is going to kind of determine the success of your product. So the user should be playing kind of a central role to all disciplines, and that includes user experience design as well as UI or visual design. So we at Rangle like to call it user research, just to make it clear that it's not just about one discipline. It's not just one discipline that should be practicing that. It's really something central to all disciplines here.
So on a typical day, what does that look like? So you're working with a client and you're sort of mapping out the role that you're going to play as part of the project. Mm-hmm. What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so what it looks like in practice, it can vary essentially from project to project. But really our job is to kind of be the advocate for the user, and that can mean different things depending on kind of the phase of the project that we're on. So if we're doing discovery, for example, that might look like going out there and doing user interviews. So working with our clients to connect us with their essentially end user so we can talk to them and understand their needs. Maybe when we're later in the development cycle, it might look like doing usability testing. So let's say we have a product that's in development. We're going to want to get feedback on that product from the end user. So there's different activities depending on the phase, but it's really all comes back to kind of being that advocate for the user at every step of the way.
And we thank you for it. Russell, I think that if I think about the term accessibility, there are some, commonplace sort of nomenclature around, things must be accessible. What does that mean? And could you talk to me what that means with regards to development and what the final assets or the software looks like when it has accessibility as its primary focus?
Sure. Accessibility is really about making sure that the things that we're building are usable by a wide audience. And so kind of the core thing, again, is about the user, which is like, who are the users that are often excluded from the things that we're building? Most commonly, we look at people who have different abilities in terms of vision, cognitive abilities, mobility issues, and hearing. And then in terms of actually, how do we actually make these things work for people in practice? We're lucky that there's kind of the governing body of the internet. The W3C has the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. And this lays out in great detail, like here are kind of the core things that you have to do to make sure that the things that you're building work for a wide range of people. These guidelines can be, quite in-depth and quite technical if you haven't read them before. But at a super high level, essentially what they're saying is make sure that everyone can, first of all, perceive the thing that you're building, make sure that they can operate it, as in they can use it, make sure it's understandable to the wide range of people, and make sure that it's robust across different, assistive technologies. So, does it work with a keyboard? Does it work with a screen reader? It's making sure that we build things in the right way so that it works for that wide range of people. And so the way we approach this, it works quite well, is accessibility is something that starts at the very beginning from the design phase. And then as we kind of write our user stories and we decide what we're building, we think about, okay, well, how does this work for a keyboard? What people might I be excluding in the way that we're building this or designing this? And then all the way through the development phase, making sure we're writing semantic HTML, all these basically just quality practices that have become quite standard, making sure that we're following those, testing those, and
And I think that just to give our the people watching or listening to the podcast a real world example is we're talking about ways that you build the metadata, so to speak, so that you could have voice over text, right? And I think those are some of the things we're talking about. So making sure that the code that you're writing is compliant so that people can use those third party tools or tools that they're using to have the text read out loud to them, or having full transcripts for people that cannot hear, etc. So it is interesting work, and agreed, it's so important. You mentioned something about a governing body that is sort of looking at these things. Is there some legal considerations when you're thinking about accessibility?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because obviously it's going to vary by jurisdiction. In Ontario, we have we're leading the way in a sense in terms of regulation in Ontario. By 2021, everything will have to meet what's called Wcag AA standards. But that Wcag document is actually more and more globally getting accepted as the kind of de facto standard around how to build things for a wide range of people. So in the US, they approach it a little bit differently. They're a little bit more, there's more litigation around it. So you'll see big cases against, Domino's, Beyonce recently. So it becomes kind of like can be damaging to your brand if you're not following these guidelines. So if you're kind of just looking for a place to start, following those guidelines is a really good way to do it. But one thing I would say is if you're aiming to get kind of the bare regulatory minimum, it ends up in a lot of cases kind of getting deprioritized and can actually be much more expensive to do if you're not kind of thinking about the user first, thinking about the users who are excluded.
Because it's not just what you're putting out there going forward, it's grandfathered to all of your content that's on your site or your property, right? So that's where it could get really expensive, right? So it's almost a form of technical debt, so to speak, right?
It is, And what we found is you can spend up to 10 times more if you're trying to fix something retroactively than thinking about it up front.
Yeah. Which sounds, again, follows that lean agile approach, right? That whole idea of do the things as you're doing them. So it's really interesting. Good segue. How does accessibility and user design, how does that drive innovation?
Right. So I think that's a really great question. There's a great kind of intersection of user research and accessibility. And, I would argue that when you're doing user research, you should always be including those users who have accessibility needs. And often those users are kind of excluded from the typical research process. And one of the ways that can actually drive innovation is that those are often the users who have kind of the greatest range of unmet needs. So, for example, technologies that are sort of around voice augmented navigation. So those are technologies that, originally helped those who were blind to navigate kind of physical spaces. And of course, those are technologies that most of us have on our phones now today. And that's something that, while it was sort of thought about as something to help meet an accessibility need, it's really something that enhances the experience for everyone. And it's something that may not have necessarily been uncovered if we had just been doing user research with, sort of that like smaller segment of the population that only tends to be represented in most cases.
And you could argue that their use case is actually so much stronger. Why would you not include them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's always like when we talk about testing on devices, it's always like, what are the far-reaching end scenarios? Why wouldn't we think about that in terms of all the ways that we're developing, right?
Exactly, and it's not just about testing on a range of devices, but testing with those people who use those devices to actually understand how do they use a screen reader, or how do they use other maybe physical assistive technologies to interact with technology. So really having that end user in the conversation really sort of enriches our understanding of those experiences.
Right. So I think all of this means that, it would lead you to believe that we're just relying on user feedback or, experience or to drive all of the decisions that we're making. But what about, as you suggested, those wonderful decisions or products that we didn't know that we wanted? And how does this, how do we navigate creating brand new digital experiences? So if we're just using, talking to the users that are using the product and making sure that they're able to accessible, whatever, how do we know, or how do we discover those things that are not known yet?
Right. So I think that's a really great question. It's one that comes up a lot in user research, is sort of how do we uncover these areas that we're not really thinking about? And often that comes to how we do the research, and it comes to our process. And a lot of times we think about user research as kind of just going out there and literally just asking the user what they want or what they need. But there's a little bit more, I would say even psychology behind it. So really the intent is to sort of work with the user either through interviews, through sort of studying how they use technology in their own environment, and kind of uncover or try to understand wherever there's areas of kind of gaps in the market or unmet needs. Mm-hmm. And usually that comes from doing sort of a range of interviews or sort of other research methods, and kind of coming back with that information to a team of people and sort of brainstorming together as a team and really sort of trying to identify what are the insights we can gain from this, and what are the areas of opportunity, or where are the areas of innovation. And that's something that comes out from sort of that process of kind of synthesizing the information that we get from going out there and talking to people.
Right. It's like the whole there's a book I read a long time ago, Paco Rabanne, whatever. It's why we buy, right? And it's that whole idea that if you're not spending time, back then I'm dating myself, but in stores with customers, watching and looking and seeing and how they devour things, like how would you ever understand any of that, right? So here's what I would find interesting. So you are working with clients. Is accessibility something that you're having to sell in as a, you must, or is it something that there is already top of mind? Like, where are we on that adoption curve?
The momentum is definitely building. I think the reason for that is that companies are realizing, first of all, from a legal point of view, it hurts their bottom line. Right. But more and more, they're realizing that, you can solve real problems for a wide range of people. This is not a small group of people. It's a very broad group of people. And so when you think about your market more broadly, you can start to plan your processes around building for that wider market. And we're seeing more companies, start to look at being on the leading edge of this. Microsoft is doing it, Google is doing it, and there's a reason for it. It's not just because they want to be good people, although I'm sure it's partly that, but they're seeing, deeper problems that they can solve.
It's amazing. So as someone who's been in marketing a long time, I like to think that I am, deeply committed and deeply customer centric, and I'm always thinking about the user. What is it that when you're working with clients, you find that you're having to, I don't know if I want to say course correct, but
right.
when they say user experience or when you're really experiencing that in real person, what is the value that you're bringing to them that says, no, you actually need to invest deeply because of...
Right. So there's probably a few different reasons for that, but I think a lot of times what we see with organizations is that they make a lot of assumptions that they already know the user really well and they already know what their needs are, and of course, typically organizations come to us with a lot of information about their users, but having that kind of second set of eyes to help them validate what they've already learned about their customers really helps bring perspective. And let's say, for example, we're working with a startup who has an idea in mind and they're really set on the fact that this is something that their audience wants. Just putting in some even really basic level of testing and going out there and validating with the customer that, this is a value proposition that's going to actually solve a problem for them will really help them to essentially make better strategic decisions. So if, for example, they need to maybe pivot on that sort of central idea that they had, it's something that they can do earlier as opposed to waiting until they're sort of later in that build phase when it's a lot more costly to pivot their decision. And it's also, of course, something that's going to deeply impact revenue, right? So if you can create a product that there's a need for and that is solving a pain point that your customers have, that's kind of speaks for itself, right? It's going to be a lot more successful than if you didn't do that validation. And often that validation doesn't necessarily even have to take a lot of time, but it helps to kind of check the bias that you might have from being really so close to that product, right? It's great to have some validation with people who are the ones who
the intended target.
The intended target,
right.
The ones that you're building that product for.
Right. And I think every VC fund manager out there that's listening to this right now is going, oh my word, if like millions of dollars could have been saved if a bunch of technical people who had a good idea would have just said, maybe we should just see if people actually want it, right? Or they need it, or are we developing it in the way that they will consume it, right?
Yeah, and you can validate at different stages of the process too, right? It's not just about doing it at the beginning, but it's also about continuing to iterate and validate throughout and make sure that you're on the right track.
Mm-hmm. Who's doing it well? Who's doing accessibility well out there? Like, you think to yourself, wow, this is best in class, deeply committed to being delightful.
Mm-hmm. I think we have a lot of homegrown talent in Ontario.
Great.
Wcag is really good, for example. They have an Inclusive Design Research Center there. And that's kind of incubated in other places now, too. Another local company is Fable, which does remote accessibility testing, which is quite nice. And what some of the people at Microsoft have started doing is also very innovative. It's been kind of a core part of their mission of this like new Microsoft, and they've kind of taken the concept of inclusive design and really put some kind of strong foundational research around it and started approaching a lot of their products from that point of view. Also, if you've seen the most recent Google keynote, if you're paying attention, more than 50% of that was actually about accessibility and helping a wider market. So, like I say, the momentum is kind of growing.
Well, and if Google or Microsoft are investing in this, it's a pretty strong message to pretty much everyone listening, right? So, I mean, if they've got deep pockets and they're saying, no, this is absolutely a priority, there's a warning bell that should be going off for everyone that says, we should all be, What about user research? Who out there is, you can obviously tell that they're doing a great job.
Yeah, I'll actually echo the idea of local talent in Ontario
great.
doing a great job. The Ontario Digital Service, they're an organization that's working with government to actually take a look at government services and how we can make some of those better for citizens. Amazing. So, not only are they sort of going out there and working with citizens and working with sort of different parts of government, but, it's really making Ontario a better place.
That's awesome. That's amazing. Go Canada, right?
Yeah.
Always, yeah. What are you excited about with regards to accessibility in the space and what's happening in the next, let's say, 18 months to 3 years? What do you see that's exciting about what this is going to do for the industry?
Yeah, I'm definitely excited because we're in this kind of phase where the infrastructure of the 21st century is, being built, and it's a digital infrastructure, right? We're starting from scratch, and, we have a chance to not make the same mistakes that we've made in the past in terms of excluding people and kind of stopping that cycle of exclusion. So I think what we're going to find over the next, 3 to 5 years is people start really paying close attention. They realize they stop kind of treating accessibility as a cost center and start thinking of it as a profit center, because it's going to lead them to solving problems for a wider range of people. And yeah, I think it'll end up with like a much more kind of delightful experience of digital technology.
And one thing I know for sure, as someone that was in retail for quite a few years, is marginalized groups who can be surprised and delighted are very vocal, and they will be very brand loyal. So there's a tail end of that, which is you have that loyalty that follows you, throughout, and they're a part of advocacy groups and community groups. So I absolutely see that as an investment for the greater good, which is pretty incredible. Yeah. And what about you? What are you excited about? Because this has changed astronomically even in the last year. So what do you see on the horizon that makes your skin tingle a little bit?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of actually fundamentally changing the way that we look at technology and the way that we look at experiences. Because I think especially as someone who has background in user experience, we've sort of really just looked at screens. Like screens as kind of flat surfaces, maybe going back to the print days, it's something that kind of mimics this like sort of flat surface, but we really need to think about augmented ways in which people interact with those experiences. It's not just about, using a mouse and being reliant on vision, but what are other ways that people interface with technology? So that could be, through touchscreen, through voice, through sound, through keyboard navigation. So it's really, I think, increasing the amount of channels and ways in which someone can interact with the experience you're building. So I think for me as an experience designer, that's kind of exciting because, it's a new challenge that we have to think about all these different ways in which someone is consuming and interacting with the experience we build. And it's also a great cause because we are being inclusive to those groups who have traditionally not been able to access and use technology as readily as hopefully they'll be able to in the future.
Right. And you want to talk about like anyone that's looking for a career out there, this is only going to go up, 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 right? So if someone's looking to choose a tech career,
Absolutely.
This, commitment to users and being user-centric and accessibility-centric is really smart to me, because there's no way that companies are ever going to go back from where they came from, right? So I cannot thank you enough for being here today. This has been really, really interesting. I'm really, really excited about the work that you're talking about, the work that you're doing, and thank you on behalf of all of the people out there looking for a delightful experience. It's really nice that you guys are working on that. So thanks so much for our guests today. We are so grateful for you for listening and watching, and we hope you found some moments that made you think or give you some insights. This is our wrangle, and we'd love to hear your wrangle on all of this. So please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter using the hashtag AskWrangle, or email us at podcast@Rangle.io. You can now watch our podcast on YouTube as well, so be sure to like and subscribe. And we just want to say thanks so much for tuning in, and we love your feedback. We hope you have a fantastic day.